I had just set down my carving knife when I heard its soft, uneven steps crunching over the hard-packed trail that wound down from the ridge. No wagon wheels, no horse hooves, and too heavy for a deer. The sound drew closer, and I rose from the porch chair, my hand settling near the revolver at my hip. Through the fence posts, three shapes came into view. Barefoot clothing torn and dusted in red dirt. They slowed when they saw me, their eyes shifting toward the barn. Then the house, then back to me, as if measuring whether they'd reached safety or just another kind of danger. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. My name's Thorne Maddox. I've spent most of my life working the land, though not in the way most folks picture when they think of a rancher. I was raised on the southern plains where my father taught me to mend a fence before I could read. And my mother taught me the worth of keeping your word. Sundays were for church, no matter the weather, and neighbors could count on us when trouble came calling, be it sickness, drought, or a long winter storm. Those lessons stayed with me long after the house I grew up in was just another patch of grass on the horizon. When I settled past Dry Knife Ridge, I chose a place few cared to find. The soil was rocky, the wind sharp, and the only trails worth riding were the ones you made yourself. Town was 8 miles downriver in Copper Run, a place where railroad men and land speculators argued in the saloon over maps and deeds, while homesteaders like me kept our heads down and prayed the disputes wouldn't reach our gates. I traded odd jobs mending corrals, shoring up mine timbers, for the things I couldn't make myself: salt coffee, a few pounds of flour. Every coin was stretched, every tool kept sharp, every plank repaired before it could rot. It wasn't a life of comfort, but it was honest and it was quiet. I'd had enough noise for a lifetime after the winter of '74, when measles took my wife and the child she carried. The fever burned hot and fast, and the fire that followed left me with nothing but a scar across my cheek and a cabin full of silence. I didn't drink, didn't gamble, and I didn't open my door to strangers. Folks in town stopped asking why I stayed out here alone. They knew enough to leave it be. That afternoon had been like any other. Splitting wood, checking the south fence, and keeping an ear tuned to the wind. The light was dropping low behind the ridge when I heard those footsteps, and by the time the three figures reached my yard, I could see the weariness in the set of their shoulders. The eldest stood in front, chin raised, though her lip was split. The one in the middle favored her ankle, her dress torn at the neckline, while the youngest kept behind them, clutching a blanket like a lifeline. They didn't speak right away, and neither did I. The air between us felt tight, like the moment before a storm breaks. I didn't yet know their names, or why they had come this far into the hills without shoes or gear. All I knew was the look in their eyes, one I'd seen before on those who'd been driven past the point of turning back. The sun had nearly set, and the wind was picking up as I stepped down from the porch. What happened next would decide whether they stayed in the open or crossed my fence line. Asha stood a half step ahead of the other two, her bare feet planted in the dust just beyond the fence line. Cuts ran along her forearms, and a split in her lip pulled tight each time she spoke. "We don't aim to take what's yours," she said, her voice rough but steady. "We just need a roof for a spell. We'll work." Behind her, Leia shifted her weight off an injured ankle, the hem of her dress torn low, and the fabric at the neckline frayed from hard use. She kept her eyes on the ground, as though any wrong glance might bring a hand down. Nomi lingered behind them both, clutching a worn blanket at her chest, her gaze darting to the tree line and back to the dirt, as if every shadow might move. I didn't ask their story. I could see enough in the bruises, in the way none of them looked me straight on except the eldest. The wind pressed dry grass against the fence posts as I stepped down from the porch. My eyes drifted to the pump near the barn, then to the loft door above the wagon bay. I gave a single nod toward it. Asha didn't hesitate, guiding Leia forward. Only once did she glance back at me. I didn't stop them, didn't speak, and I didn't reach for the pistol on my hip. That seemed to tell them more than words could. The barn was clean with fresh straw and a barrel full of water. I'd spent enough nights in there myself to know it was warmer than sleeping under the open sky. That evening they climbed to the loft without a word, and I took my seat on the porch with the shotgun laid easy across my knees. The night was quiet but for the insects. Yet my mind kept turning over what trouble might be following them. Men don't leave marks like those and just give up the chase. By morning, the water bucket by the pump had been emptied and refilled the trough, scrubbed the rope neatly coiled at the well. Leah stood outside the barn, feeding the mule with slow, careful movements despite the limp. Her hair fell forward in the breeze, the fabric at her shoulders slipping again, but she didn't bother to fix it. Asha was in my kitchen stacking kindling by the stove, while Nomi sat near the fence line, her knees pulled up, watching everything without meeting anyone's eyes. I set smoked meat, a tin of beans, and coffee grounds on the porch rail before heading to the south fence. When I came back, the food was gone and the plate cleaned. 4 days passed that way. They worked without being asked, mucking stalls, sweeping the porch steps, clearing brush from the side yard. They didn't cross the threshold of the house, and I didn't invite them in. Something in that unspoken boundary seemed to matter to all of us. Still, I found myself noting how many blankets I'd laid out in the loft, how many clean plates waited for me on the rail each morning. That 5th morning, the sun was still low when I stepped outside with a bucket of oats. Leah was already in the yard, sleeves rolled to her elbows, feeding the mule from her hands. Her ankle was still swollen, but she stood steady on it. I told her she didn't have to do it. "It likes me," she answered without looking back. I asked then if they were running from someone. She froze, and it was Asha's voice that came from the well. "We were taken," she said plainly, "from a camp near the Verde. Men came in the night, tied the others, took what they wanted. We slipped away 2 nights later. I didn't ask for more." She went on saying they'd heard of a man up here who didn't pry, so they came. I told her I didn't. She said they only needed to stay until it was safe to move on. They had no people left. That afternoon, I let them into the front room of the house. I set a folded quilt and a few of my wife's old clothes on the table without explanation, then left them to it. When I came back near sundown, the clothes were gone. The quilt refolded, a pot of beans simmering on the stove and cornbread cooling on the table. That night, Leah stood on the porch, her shoulder mended with coarse gray thread. She thanked me in a voice so quiet, I almost missed it. Inside, Asha stirred the fire while Nomi hummed low under the quilt. It wasn't the hum of someone happy, just a sound to fill the space. For the first time in years, the house felt less like an empty shell. The days settled into a rhythm. I rose before first light to check the fences and split wood. By mid-morning, the ash pan would be emptied, the porch swept, and the barn mucked out. Leah carried water despite the limp, even taking the bucket from me one morning with a firm "I can." Asha inspected the walls, cleared brush from the foundation, and stacked firewood high against the kitchen wall. She'd asked once if there was a spare rifle for hunting. I told her there was, and she kept it near the door when I was away. Nomi stayed closest to her sisters, brushing the mule, feeding the chickens, and sorting beans on the porch table. She still flinched at loud noises, but she'd started humming again while she worked. One evening, Asha brought in 2 rabbits she'd trapped, her sleeves rolled and skirt muddied to the knees. She asked if I wanted them boiled. I told her to use the garlic above the hearth and a little salt. She mentioned my wife in passing, then let the subject drop when I didn't answer. That night, we all ate at the same table, 4 tin plates around a shared pot. Nomi thanked me. Leah watched my hands more than my face. After the meal, Leah lingered in the kitchen while Asha took Nomi to the barn. She asked how long I'd been married and if I'd loved her. I told her 8 years, and yes. Then she asked if my wife had died here. No, in town with the measles. Leah said she was sorry. As she turned to go, I told her she wasn't safe yet. Reich and his men would still be looking. She asked if I thought they'd find us. I said we'd deal with it if they came. It wasn't a promise, but it was the truth. Later, she came out to the porch, wrapped in the same patched shawl she'd worn the first night. She sat beside me, leaving space, but not much. She asked why I'd let them stay. I told her it didn't seem right to send them off. She said some folks would have. I told her I wasn't some folks. She smiled faintly, and we sat there in the dark, not running, not asking, just staying. By the 7th day, the routine felt like it had been there all along. I still kept the spare bedroom clean across the hall, but they stayed in the loft by choice. That morning, while I shaved, I caught my reflection scar more pronounced, beard grayer. I didn't look like someone a woman would trust, yet they stayed. Outside, Leia worked in the vegetable patch, sweat on her brow, dirt on her forearms. She said it felt good to do something real. I told her hard work kept the noise down. She met my eyes fully for the first time and said there was a lot of noise in her. That afternoon, a dust cloud rose from the north trail. One rider moving slow, scanning the ground. I loaded the rifle and watched from the back of the house. He stopped on the far ridge, waited, then turned away. At supper, I told them. Asha's jaw tightened. She said it could be one of Reich's men and that we should leave before dark. I told her running now wouldn't help. They had food walls and someone ready to shoot back if it came to that. She didn't argue. After the dishes were done, Leia stood in the doorway where I sat oiling the rifle. She asked again why I was helping them. I said they hadn't done anything to deserve what was done to them, and that was enough. She told me she hadn't been touched, though they'd tried. She said she'd kept running. I told her it didn't matter whether they got close or not, you carry it just the same. She put her hand over mine and said she knew I carried things too. Then she rested her head on my shoulder for a moment, long enough for the world to go quiet. A week after the rider passed, no one else came down the trail. Still, the air felt watchful. Asha walked the perimeter twice a day with the Winchester across her back. Nomi began speaking more around the animals, brushing down the mule each morning and feeding the chickens without being told. I realized I was listening less for silence and more for the sound of them moving about. That morning, Leia brought me coffee out by the barn. She said she'd mended the hem of a flannel shirt I'd left by the wash basin. We stood at the fence together, her fingers brushing mine briefly without either of us pulling away. She told me this was the first place she'd slept without dreaming of running. I didn't answer, but something in my chest shifted. As dusk fell that evening, hoofbeats carried down the trail again. The hoofbeats slowed as the rider came into view, dust curling around his horse's legs in the last light of the day. He stopped short of the fence, his hat pulled low and eyes scanning the yard. I kept to the porch, one hand resting near the rifle propped against the post. He didn't call out, just studied the place for a long moment before wheeling the horse and heading back the way he'd come. The sound of iron shoes faded into the ridge, leaving only the wind. Inside, Asha was stacking wood by the stove. I told her what I'd seen. She set the kindling down and straightened her jaw, tightening. Could be one of Reich's men, she said. If it is, they know where to look now. Leia, standing at the counter, kept her eyes on the bread dough she was shaping. Nomi glanced between us, her hands curling in the fabric of her skirt. I said we'd keep steady, no running, not yet. Asha didn't argue, but she stayed near the door until the lamps were turned low. The next morning came with a clear sky and a hard frost clinging to the grass. Leia moved slower than usual, her limp more pronounced in the cold. She still carried water from the well, steam rising from the bucket in the chill air. I mended a section of fence while Asha walked the perimeter with the Winchester slung across her back. Nomi busied herself brushing the mule, her voice humming a tune so soft it barely reached the yard. Later, while I was sweeping out the barn, I heard footsteps in the doorway. Leia stood there holding 2 tin cups of coffee, her shawl pulled snug. She handed me one and leaned against the frame watching me work. "I fixed the stitching on that flannel shirt you left by the basin," she said. "Didn't seem right to let it fray." I nodded and told her it was worth keeping. She smiled faintly before turning her gaze out to the pasture. By midday, the wind shifted and carried the scent of a cook fire from somewhere beyond the ridge. Asha returned from her circuit with a small brace of quail, saying she'd seen no one, but the tracks on the north trail were fresh. We cleaned the birds together in the yard, our hands working in quiet rhythm. When the meal was roasting later, Nomi slipped into the kitchen to set the table. Her movements were careful, her eyes brighter than when she'd first arrived. It was near dusk when hoofbeats sounded again, this time from the south trail. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, but lowered. The rider was a man I knew, Tom Belden from Copper Run, his coat dusty from the ride. He dismounted at the gate and tipped his hat. "Ain't here to trouble you," he said. "But you ought to know there's talk in town. Reich's putting up flyers offering coin for 3 Apache women he says went missing near the Verde. Claims they're his by contract." Tom reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded sheet. I took it and opened it under the fading light. The sketches were rough, but clear. Asha's sharp features. Nomi's wide eyes, Leia with her dress neckline drawn lower than it was. Beneath the words, marked them as stolen property. My grip tightened on the paper. "Tom said the marshal wouldn't touch it, called it a property dispute. Figured you'd want to see it before the wrong sort did," he added. I thanked him, and he rode out before full dark. Inside, I laid the flyer on the table. Nomi's breath caught when she saw it. Asha's hands curled into fists. Leia studied the sketch of herself for a long moment, then looked up at me. "We didn't ask you for this," she said. I told her I hadn't asked for trouble either, but it had come. "I can make it legal," I said. Asha narrowed her eyes. How I told them a name on paper could keep any man from claiming them. If I married one of them, the law would stand with her. I said I wouldn't do it unless one of them asked it. The fire popped in the stove, and the room went still. Then Leia stepped forward. "I'll take your name," she said. Asha looked at her sharply, but stayed quiet. Leia met my eyes. "Not to hide. I want to stop running. This place feels safe. You never asked for anything in return." I nodded once. "We go tomorrow." There was no more said. Asha sat back down, her gaze fixed on the fire. Nomi moved to stand beside her sister. The rest of the evening passed in quiet preparation, Leia mending the hem of her dress, Asha oiling the rifle, Nomi folding blankets in the loft. Before first light, I saddled the mule and checked the cinch twice. Leia came down from the loft with her hair braided, wearing the patched shawl from the night they arrived. Her dress was clean, the mending at the shoulders and sides holding firm. Asha stood on the porch with her arms crossed, Nomi beside her clutching the blanket. "You sure?" Asha asked. Leia answered without hesitation. "I want to stop running." The ride to Copper Run was quiet, the cold morning air sharp in our lungs. The town was waking as we came in along the main road, passing the blacksmith's shop and the half-built church tower, casting a long shadow across the street. We stopped at the clapboard courthouse. Inside, the air smelled of paper and lamp oil. Judge Conacade looked up from his desk, adjusting his spectacles, when he saw me. "Maddox," he said. "Been a long while. I told him we needed to file marriage papers." He glanced at Leia. "She willing?" She stepped forward. "I am." He asked if it was to cover trouble. I said it was to stop it. He shrugged and reached for the forms. We signed me first, then Leia, in a steady hand. The judge stamped the paper and handed me a copy. Outside, the wind had picked up dust, curling around our boots. Leia looked up at me. "You going to kiss me?" she asked, her voice steady. I glanced at the street, then back to her. If you want that, I wouldn't have signed if I didn't. I cupped her cheek and kissed her slow, certain, without haste. When we pulled apart, her hand rested on my chest for a moment longer before we turned back toward the mule. The ride home felt different. She leaned into me slightly, the brim of her bonnet brushing my jaw. When we reached the cabin, Asha was waiting at the porch. Leia handed her the stamped paper. Nomi peeked over her shoulder, her lips parting when she saw the name Leia Maddox written clear. We all went inside as the day turned cold, and for the first time since they'd come, the air in the house felt settled. The stamped paper lay on the table that evening, its edges curling slightly where the ink hadn't dried clean. Asha studied it without touching, her arms folded, while Nomi leaned in close enough for her hair to brush the page. Leia busied herself at the stove ladling stew into bowls without looking over. When the meal was served, we sat without ceremony, 4 tin plates between us. The quiet felt different than before. Not heavy, but waiting. After supper, Leia lingered as the others went about their chores. She crossed to where I sat by the fire, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder, before she moved past me to check the shutters. Outside, the air had turned colder, the wind pushing through the gaps in the eaves. I banked the coals and locked the door, the sound of her footsteps soft on the pine boards overhead. The next morning, she came to the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, wearing one of my old flannel shirts over her dress. She handed me a cup, her fingers brushing mine. "It's warmer than I thought," she said, glancing toward the frost on the grass. Asha was already in the yard, Winchesters slung over her back as she walked the fence line. Nomi followed a few paces behind, carrying a small bucket of feed for the chickens. The rhythm of their movements settled into the day, like it had been there for years. By midday, I had the south gate propped open to clear a snagged hinge. Leia stood nearby, holding the jar of nails, without being asked. "You always been alone since her?" she asked. I told her I had for the most part. No brothers, no parents left to speak of. She nodded, her gaze on the open pasture. "We never had a place," she said quietly. "Camp to camp, army moving us, then the traders, then Reich. This is the first time I've slept without thinking about running." The afternoon brought the smell of dust on the wind and the faint sound of riders in the distance. I stepped to the porch, scanning the horizon. 4 silhouettes came into view, moving slow along the trail. Lamps stayed dark, shutters drawn. Asha appeared at my side with the Winchester, her stance solid. Leia and Nomi stayed inside. The riders stopped just beyond the fence, the lead man dismounting with deliberate ease. Even at that distance, I recognized Reich's build, the broad shoulders, the neat beard. "Evening," he called. "We're looking for what's ours." 3 women. 1 tall and loud, one with a limp, one too young for the trouble they've caused. Belong to me. I raised the rifle, not fast, but enough. They belong to no one. And the one with my name is no one's bounty. He chuckled low. "You married one." "You think that changes the truth?" My voice carried back steady. "It changes what the law says, and it changes what you'll face if you cross that fence." He studied me for a moment, then shifted his gaze to Asha. "You always had a mouth on you." Her reply was even. "And I'll still have one when you're gone. You've got 2 minutes to turn around." The wind pushed hard enough to rattle the loose boards on the barn. Reich looked once more toward the dark windows, the line of the fence, the set of my stance. He spit into the dirt, muttering something I didn't catch, then swung into the saddle. "Not worth the lead," he said to no one in particular. The 4 of them turned their horses' hooves, drumming a slow retreat until the sound faded over the ridge. I didn't lower the rifle until the last trace of dust was gone. The door behind me opened, and Leia stepped out, her eyes searching mine. "They're gone?" she asked. I nodded once. She crossed the porch and wrapped her arms around my waist, her cheek pressed to my chest. "Why?" she whispered. My hand settled on her back. "Because you're mine now." She didn't answer, but she didn't let go for a long moment. The days that followed were quiet, the air holding that same watchful stillness as before a storm. Asha kept to her circuits around the property, her eyes sharp on the ridges. Nomi began speaking more freely, especially to the animals, brushing the mule each morning and laughing softly when the chickens pecked at her boots. Leia planted winter vegetables in the garden, kneeling in the cold earth with her sleeves rolled high. In the evenings, she sat beside me at the table, our hands brushing now and then without thought. One night, as the fire burned low, she stood at the window brushing her hair. The lamplight caught the curve of her collarbone, the front of her dress open just enough to show the rise of her chest. She turned the brush, pausing in her hand. "You don't look at me like I'm broken," she said. I met her gaze. "You're not." She crossed the floor barefoot, sat beside me, and leaned into my side. Her voice dropped low. "I'm late," she said. I searched her face. "You sure?" She nodded. "I've counted. It's not the first time I've worried, but this feels different." I told her we'd take it one day at a time. She didn't speak again, just stayed there with her head resting against me. Outside, the wind shifted colder now. The seasons were turning. The first snow came early, dusting the higher ridges white by the end of October. I patched the roof before the freeze set in and cut a second chimney for the barn stove. Inside, the work didn't stop Asha salting down the last of the venison Nomi. Reading haltingly from an old primer, Leia moving slower now, her hand drifting often to her middle. She never said more about it, but she didn't have to. That morning, she caught me watching her from the rocker by the window. "I think it's real," she said simply. I stood and placed my hand over hers. "Then it's ours," I told her. She held my eyes for a long moment before turning back to the stove. Asha came in with a bundle of kindling snow still clinging to her shoulders. She set it down, glanced between us, and said nothing. But something in her expression softened. Later, she offered to go with me to check tracks near the ridge. The snow was light, just enough to quiet the world underfoot. We rode without much talk, dismounting near the line of junipers. As we followed the trail, she finally spoke. "Leia told me," she said. I didn't ask what she meant. "You ready for that?" I told her no, but I would be. She nodded and we went on. By the time we returned with a young buck tied to the saddle, the sun was down and the cold sharp in our lungs. Nomi ran barefoot into the yard before Asha sent her back inside. Leia waited on the porch, her hands clasped tight. When I reached the steps, she said, "I'm sure now." I missed again. I wrapped my arms around her without a word. The snow was falling thicker by then, but inside the fire was steady and the air warm. Snow had settled deep into the low spots by the first week of November, crusted over in the mornings, so it cracked under a boot. The stove in the front room never cooled completely, and the air in the cabin held the faint scent of wood smoke no matter the hour. Leia moved slower now, her hand often resting against her middle, but she kept to her chores, sweeping the floors and tending the small garden beds she'd covered against the frost. Asha kept the woodpile high, splitting fresh logs with sure swings, while Nomi read haltingly from the worn primer I'd found her voice carrying soft through the room. One afternoon, I was mending a broken hinge on the barn door when Leia came out, her hair tucked back and her breath showing in the cold. She held a mug of coffee toward me, her other hand on her side. "You've been out here a while," she said. I took the cup, the heat seeping into my fingers. From the yard, Nomi called for Asha, who appeared with the Winchester resting easy in the crook of her arm. "Tracks near the north fence again," she said. I asked if they were fresh. She nodded, the look in her eyes, making it clear she thought someone was circling. We followed the sign to where the fence dipped toward a stand of junipers. Hoof prints marked the snow, the edges still sharp. Whoever it was hadn't come closer than the fence line, but they'd stayed long enough to look over the land. We checked the rest of the property, then came back to the cabin before full dark. Inside, Leia was at the stove, the scent of stew filling the room. She glanced at us when we stepped in, her expression shifting slightly at the sight of Asha's rifle. That night, the wind rattled the shutters hard enough to wake me. I lay still, listening for any sound beyond the gusts. In the next room, floorboards creaked. Asha on watch. I rose and joined her by the front window. She didn't look away from the yard when she said, "You think they'll try to come up here again?" I told her they might. She shifted her weight, the rifle steady in her hands. Then they'd best be ready for the answer. The following morning broke clear, the cold sharper than it had been all season. I found Leia in the garden beds, uncovering the rows just enough to check the soil. "Hard frost," she said when I came up beside her. "But the roots are holding." She straightened slowly, and I saw her wince before brushing it off. We walked back toward the cabin together, the snow crunching under our boots. By late afternoon, clouds had rolled in, dimming the light. I was inside mending tack when Asha came to the door. "Riders," she said simply. I stepped onto the porch and saw them, a pair this time, moving along the southern trail, not in a hurry. They didn't come closer than the fence, just paused to look before turning toward the ridge. Still, the sight of them carried weight. At supper, we spoke of it plainly. Nomi pushed her food around the plate, but listened, her eyes moving between each of us. Leia set her fork down. "If they're watching, they're waiting for something." I nodded. "Then we keep ready." Asha's jaw was set, but she didn't argue. The meal ended in quiet, each of us turning to our own work. That evening, Leia came to the porch while I was checking the last of the kindling stacked against the wall. She stood beside me, looking out toward the dark line of the ridge. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. I shook my head. "Built this place myself, every post and gate. Don't see reason to walk from it now." She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "It's the first place I've wanted to stay." The next day was cold enough to make the pump handle bite at bare skin. I was hauling water when Nomi came from the barn, her cheeks red from the wind. "Mule's restless," she said. I followed her in to check, but found nothing wrong beyond the animal's steady shifting. Outside, Asha made another slow circuit of the yard, scanning each ridgeline before disappearing behind the garden beds. That night, the snow began again. We sat around the fire after supper, the light low, and the sound of the storm close against the walls. Asha leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed. "Don't need papers," she said suddenly. "Don't need promises. But if you ever wanted to make this permanent, I'd stay." I met her gaze across the table. "You've already stayed. That's what counts." She gave a short nod, then looked away toward the flames. Leia reached for my hand under the table, pressing it gently against her stomach. Nomi smiled faintly from her place near the hearth, her book resting in her lap. Outside, the wind rose, but inside the cabin held steady warmth. We stayed there together until the lamps burned low, the fire settling into coals. The snow kept on through the night, piling high against the porch steps. By morning, the world beyond the yard was white and still. I stood at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the flakes drift, when a movement caught my eye, a lone figure on horseback just cresting the far ridge. The figure on horseback didn't press close, keeping to the far ridge where the snow thinned over wind-scoured rock. I stepped out to the porch, the cold air biting against my face, and watched him pause at the crest. He sat his horse easy, turning in the saddle to look down over the spread. Even from that distance, I could feel the measure in his gaze. He stayed a moment longer, then tipped his hat low and disappeared behind the rise. Inside, the fire cracked in the stove. Asha set her rifle down beside the door, glancing toward the window. "Did he see you?" she asked. "If he was looking, he did," I said. Nomi was at the table with her book, but she stopped reading, eyes flicking between us. Leia stayed by the stove, her hand resting over her middle, silent, but listening. The day passed without sign of the rider again. but the air felt different. I checked the rifle by the porch, made sure the spare was cleaned and ready. Asha moved through her rounds twice before dark her tracks, marking long loops in the snow. Leia finished mending a pair of my shirts and set them folded on the chair by my bed. Nomi fed the mule and brushed it down until the animal stood drowsy in the stall. By evening, clouds had rolled in thick. I was oiling the latch on the back door when hoofbeats carried faint through the wind. This time there was more than one horse. Asha met my eyes from across the room, reached for the Winchester, and checked the chamber. I stepped out first, the cold sharp in my lungs. 3 riders approached from the north trail, moving slow but steady, their silhouettes breaking the line of snow against the trees. They stopped at the fence, none of them dismounting. The man in the middle wore a dark coat, buttoned high scarf, drawn up to his cheekbones. He raised a hand palm out. "Evening," he called. I didn't answer. "We're just here to talk," he went on. "Word is Reich's been stirring folks up about those women you've got on your land, offering coin. Some might take him up on it." Asha stepped up beside me. "And you?" she asked. "Not me," he said. "Name's Carter Mills. I keep the weigh scales at Copper Run. Thought you'd want to know he was in town 2 days back, left with 3 others, headed this direction." The snow swirled between us, filling the quiet. "Appreciate the warning," I said. He tipped his head. "Best keep your eyes on the ridge. He's the sort to come at night." The 3 of them turned their horses and rode off, their outlines fading into the gray. When the yard was empty again, I felt Leia's presence at my back. "Was he telling the truth?" she asked. "Could be," I said. "We act like he was." Asha kept the rifle across her knees the rest of the evening, the lamplight glinting off the barrel. For the next 2 days, the snow didn't let up. The world outside the cabin walls was white and muffled, each sound carrying strange through the still air. I made shorter rounds, staying close to the house. Asha and I took turns sitting the front room, rifles within reach. Leia kept the fire high, Nomi close by her side. On the 3rd night, the wind died. I stepped outside just after lamp out, the cold settling into my coat. The snow underfoot was crusted hard enough to hold my weight. I listened, no hoofbeats, no movement beyond the creak of ice in the trees. The moon broke through the clouds, casting the yard in pale light. The next morning, the tracks were there. 4 sets coming in from the north, stopping short of the fence. They'd been close enough to see the barn doors, close enough to count the windows. The prints turned back the way they came. I followed them to the ridge until the snow gave way to wind-bared ground and the trail vanished. When I returned, Leia was waiting on the porch, shawl drawn tight. "How close?" she asked. "Close enough," I said. Asha came from the side yard, her expression unreadable. "Then they're picking their time," she said. I nodded. "And we'll be ready when they do." We spent the day preparing. I checked every latch, cut fresh slots in the fence rails for better lines of sight, and stacked extra wood inside both the house and barn. Asha laid out cartridges on the table, counting them twice before sliding them into neat rows. Leia baked bread and stew to keep for the coming days, her movements steady, despite the weight she carried now. Nomi helped where she could, her hands quick and careful. By the time darkness fell, the yard was quiet under the snow. The air had that held-breath stillness that comes before something breaks. We sat in the front room, the fire throwing light against the walls. Asha sat nearest the door, her rifle balanced across her lap. Leia's hand found mine where it rested on my knee, her fingers tightening just enough for me to feel it. Outside, somewhere beyond the fence, a horse gave a low, restless snort. The wind was still when the first shadow crossed the fence line. I was in the front room with Asha when she leaned toward the window, her voice low. 2 of them coming from the north. Leia and Nomi stayed in the kitchen, the lamplight kept low so the glass wouldn't shine. I stepped to the door and eased it open. Snow crunched under hooves somewhere past the barn. The shapes moved closer, and I caught the outline of a third rider hanging back near the cottonwoods. The moon threw just enough light to see the glint of a rifle barrel. Asha met my eyes. Not strangers. She meant Reich. We'd known this was coming. I motioned her toward the side window, then slipped out into the yard. The cold burned my lungs as I crossed to the barn, staying low by the fence rail. From inside, the mule shifted, sensing movement beyond the wall. When the first rider reached the gate, he dismounted. His boots sank deep in the snow as he came forward, hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Evening," he called, though his voice carried no warmth. "We're looking for some folks been keeping what ain't theirs." I stayed in the shadow by the barn, my rifle steady. "You're on private land," I said. "Turn back." A chuckle came from the man behind him, Reich. "Don't reckon we will. Heard you've been hiding Apache women out here. That's worth money to some, and I got debts to settle." From the corner of my eye, I saw Asha shift position at the window. A thin line of breath rose in the moonlight from the barrel of her rifle. Reich took another step toward the house. "You can make this easy," he said. "Or—" The crack of Asha's shot split the air, kicking snow at his feet. The sound rolled across the ridge, scattering roosting birds from the pines. The man nearest him flinched, stumbling back toward his horse. "You've had your warning," I said. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Reich spat into the snow, anger tight in his jaw. "This ain't over," he said. He swung into the saddle, and the three of them rode back the way they'd come, their shapes melting into the dark beyond the cottonwoods. Inside, Leia was by the door, her shawl clutched tight. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Likely with more." "We'll be ready," I told her. The next day, we worked without pause. I reinforced the fence rails along the north side and dug firing steps into the snow behind the outbuildings. Asha checked every rifle twice, laying the cartridges where they could be reached in the dark. Leia packed provisions into sacks, bread, smoked meat, a crock of beans, while Nomi carried water to the barn. That night, the snow stopped. The moon was clear, the air so cold it snapped in the lungs. I sat in the front room with the lamp out, listening to the boards creak in the frost. Near midnight, the sound came faint at first, then clearer. Hoofbeats. More than 3 this time. I moved to the window. Shadows spilled over the ridge riders, spreading wide as they approached. I stepped outside the snow, squeaking under my boots. Asha was already there, rifle braced on the fence post. Leia and Nomi stayed in the dark of the doorway. Reich's voice carried across the yard. "This time you won't scare us off." The cold air seemed to hold still, every sound sharp. I took my position beside Asha, my finger resting near the trigger. "Then you'd better be sure of your aim," I said. The horses slowed their breath, steaming in the moonlight. In the silence that followed, a dog barked far off in the hills. It was going to break before dawn. The moon hung low when Reich and his men made their move. They came in fast, fanning out across the yard, but the snow betrayed them. Every hoofbeat, every crunch under their boots carried clear in the frozen stillness. Asha's rifle spoke first, a sharp crack that echoed off the ridge. One man dropped his pistol and the snow hands flying up. I stepped out from the barn rifle, steady, my breath curling in the cold. "Drop your weapons," I called. "You're done here." Reich hesitated, jaw tight. His eyes darted toward the dark hills, maybe thinking he could still ride out. But Leia and Nomi had stepped from the porch, each with a shotgun braced firm. There was nowhere left for him to go. The county sheriff arrived before dawn, having ridden hard from Pine Crossing after a telegraph reached him. His deputies bound Reich and his men, leading them off under the pale morning light. The snow squeaked under their boots, the only sound besides the jangle of chains. When the last rider disappeared over the ridge, the yard fell quiet again. The cold bit deep, but the air felt lighter somehow. like the land itself had been holding its breath. We spent the morning mending what had been broken rails, splintered in the fight, the barn door hanging crooked. Asha worked beside me without a word, the rhythm of the hammer steady and sure. Leia brought coffee out in tin mugs, steam curling up into the crisp air. By evening, the sky turned to fire in the west, streaks of orange fading to deep purple. We sat on the porch, the four of us wrapped in blankets against the cold. Out past the fence, the snow caught the last of the light, glowing faintly before night took hold. Life on the frontier doesn't hand out easy victories. Justice here comes slow, and it costs something from everyone who stands for it. But as I looked at the women beside me, I knew the fight had been worth it. This land has a way of testing what you're made of. Some folks measure worth in cattle coin or acres. I've learned it's measured in who you choose to stand with when the wind turns bitter. If you've ever faced down a long winter and found someone willing to keep the fire burning beside you, you already know the truth. Family is not just the one you're born to. It's the one you keep. Thank you for riding through this story with me. If it left you with something to carry into your own trail ahead, share it with someone who might need the warmth.